Hi, this is Sharon Leishman with Duwamish Alive Coalition on Rainier Avenue Radio, introducing our new local environmental program, Duwamish Alive. We believe Earth Day is every day, and understanding our natural world that we live in is crucial, not only to the health of our environment, but also to our communities as well. So, we are all connected. And we've been talking about our Duwamish watershed. Now we want to delve deeper into an important aspect of it, ecosystems. So our guest is Alicia Kellogg. Thank you, Alicia, for coming back.
Happy to be here.
And Alicia is with King County. She is the Duwamish Basin watershed. So first off,
Watershed Steward.
Watershed Steward. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. So ecosystems, I mean, it's a term we hear a lot when we're talking about environmental issues and different parts of the environment. So can you explain exactly what we mean by ecosystem and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. You're right. It is a term that gets used a lot, and we can take it for granted. I think part of defining an ecosystem is right there in the name, system. And I think of it kind of like, your bodily functions and the way that your body works as a system. There are lots of different elements to our environment. And so an ecosystem really just is a community of animals and other kinds of wildlife, plants, habitats, environments that all work together to function ideally in balance with itself. So just the same way that if, you can't breathe very well because you have a lungs problem, that's going to affect everything about your body and everything that you do. Things in an ecosystem need to all be functioning the right way with each other for those ecosystems to be healthy and happy.
So I'm kind of thinking, if I were relating to it as a person, my ecosystem might be, okay, where I live, how I get my food, my safety.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there are also things that, we don't think about until they are failing. So one thing that people talk about in the city is, for instance, like the heat island effect, which is when we have a lot of paved areas, a lot of asphalt, areas that normally, if we weren't here, would be maybe dirt and be a lot cooler, and we don't have enough trees, and that sun just comes down and reflects off of our paved surfaces. So this is one of those examples where our trees are providing something that's called an ecosystem service. So there are things that are being provided for us that we don't even need to pay attention to until something's going wrong. Same with things like water quality and air quality and the way that trees and plants can filter air. These are things that often we don't pay attention to until there's an
So
error.
you used another word that, quite frankly, is becoming more and more prevalent in conversations, and I did not really understand it initially, but you're talking about eco services. So, eco services, can you give, for humans anyway, can you give some example, define it? What is a service? Because it's really a benefit, right, to health, right? And you were just talking a little bit about eco services. Can you tell a little bit more about that?
It's kind of a funny term because the reason I think we talk this way is in order to justify supporting our ecosystem. But ecosystem services are really just the ways that we benefit from nature and that we benefit from our ecosystem. It's essentially free work for us that we don't have to do for ourselves. So there are some things that are really direct, like we get our food, like you were talking about. We might get things like timber or medicine or our drinking water. There are other things that maybe are less direct and less obvious, things like the way that, like I was saying, trees can clean the air and help with water, air quality. Wetlands can clean water and help with water quality, and things like the way that predators might keep pests in check. We don't have to worry about, plagues of mosquitoes because we have bats eating them, things like that. There's also things like cultural services. I think if you've lived in this area, then you understand that, salmon aren't just an animal that we like. It's part of the culture of this space. It's a part of the culture of the indigenous people who lived here for thousands and thousands of years before European settlers came along. And that's something that's shouldn't be discredited just because you can't necessarily put like a number on it.
So it's really going back to how we're connected to nature in many different ways.
Absolutely.
And that it is part of our well-being in many ways. So what are some of the ecosystem services that people may not realize that they depend on beyond the trees and the air quality?
Yeah, I think there's, some of the things I just listed are maybe some more of the obvious ones, but I think there are things that we don't think of until you bring it up. Having green spaces, having access to green spaces is really important for people's psychological and emotional well-being. It's really important for people's physical well-being to be able to get out and walk around. I think, we talk about ecosystem services because it's a way that we can then put money and resources towards things so we can justify the way that nature's giving us things. But there's just a lot more. It's
how we value.
Exactly. We live in a capitalist society, so it helps to talk about the benefits from the environment in a way that translates into, quantitative things. But there's a lot more to it than just the obvious stuff.
Yes, and there's a lot of studies. In fact, there's been many studies in the Duwamish Valley about making that connection between healthy, clean air, and that connection to health, especially, South Park and the Duwamish River Community Coalition has done a lot of work with that. Yeah. And again, it comes back to connections that we depend in many ways on the natural world for our health and economic reasons as well.
Absolutely. And you bring up a really good point, which is that, there's a ton of information and research done that shows the correlation between if you live next to a greenway versus next to the highway, and what your health outcomes are going to be, what your education outcomes are going to be, what your socioeconomic outcomes are going to be. And I don't think it takes a lot of, understanding about complex ecosystems to see that, well, if everyone along the I-5 corridor has higher rates of asthma than people who don't, I feel like we can see what is causing that. We understand why that is happening.
Yeah. And so ecosystems, they have formed these different elements, right, that are all interconnected. So what happens when one of those elements fails? And I'm thinking about, you talked in our previous conversation about the importance of salmon and how they're a keystone species. So what happens to if the salmon in the ecosystem, in others' ecosystems where they're a keystone species, what happens if they go away? I mean, I'm kind of thinking of the orca because a lot of people understand that we have this very fragile southern resident orca population.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good one to bring up too, because salmon, I said this last time, I'm just in love with salmon. I think that they're incredible. And I think if you don't love them, then you don't know enough about salmon. But they aren't exactly charming the way that orcas are. It's really easy. As soon as you see an orca, they're just beautiful and they're magnificent and they're graceful. And they primarily subsist on salmon. And when our salmon populations start to decline, that directly impacts our orca population. It also, you mentioned salmon being a keystone species. And I think in a way that they're also very sensitive, which is unfortunate for the salmon, but really good for us because they're also an indicator species. So we can use the salmon's health to determine if there's something wrong that we're not understanding. They're kind of like the canary in the coal mine, which is one of the things that has happened with, early, I don't remember what that's called, early die-off, pre-spawn mortality with the coho salmon. So when things go wrong, we start to see it in declining populations of animals. We start to see it in early deaths of animals. We start to see it in just, the imbalances in the ecosystem eventually make their way up to a place where we start to pay attention to them.
And I'm thinking about now, I want to be clear, we don't have orca in the, Duwamish watershed, but it also underlines the fact that there is a greater ecosystem. And our orca, yes, they depend on Duwamish salmon, especially since Chinook spawn in the Duwamish River. But then when you're looking at some of the issues that the orca are having, you're looking at their ecosystem, and it's not only their food supply, but it's also, clean, that, the waters are polluted. So, you start unraveling. That's why ecosystem focus is really important, because it shows you how all these little elements are connected to the health of a species.
Absolutely. It's very easy for us who live in urban areas to think of it as a divide. There are spaces that are people and cities, and then there are spaces that are nature and animals and plants. And that doesn't exist. That's just something we've made up in our minds to separate ourselves out. But we are affecting our ecosystem, and our ecosystem is affecting us.
And so, looking at ecosystems, and we have many different ecosystems, right? So I'm just wondering, we live in a very urbanized watershed, and can you maybe address some of the ecosystems that you're finding in our watershed? And then, how do they differ from maybe the ecosystems in, up higher in the watershed that has a more natural area?
Absolutely. Our ecosystems here in the city, and particularly along the Duwamish corridor, it's very urbanized. So it's an urban ecosystem, and that means that humans play a larger role, that we have altered the environment in ways that are potentially really disruptive to the natural ecosystem that has evolved over thousands, millions of years. And I think in some ways we are seeing what the effects of that have been. So, when the Ship Canal was cut and it lowered the the level of Lake Washington, and the Black River dried up, there's reports of people seeing firsthand that watching the Black River drain and watching that disappear before their eyes. They weren't given any kind of warning, and watching these fish just flop around on dry land because no one had planned for this, and no one really cared at the time, the people who were engineering this. So the things that we have done in our urban areas have been tremendous, especially here in Seattle. We've just done a lot of moving around of the land and altering our ecosystem. And it's just different. If you get up higher in the watershed where there are fewer people, you're going to have less impermeable surfaces. You're going to have fewer petroleum products that can wash away into our rivers and freshwater services. You're going to have a lot more, a higher diversity of wildlife and plants, just because there's more space for them. So our ecosystems here are still very real. They're just urban. It just looks a little different. And it's up to us to figure out the ways that we can work in balance with the nature around us so that we aren't disrupting things, and so that we can continue to live here healthfully.
One of the things when I first started working in the Duwamish, you don't really think about this, but the importance of just insects. I mean, we've kind of, yes, certain insects are annoying, i.e. mosquitoes, but they are a cornerstone for so many species. And I think that's one of the things when I'm talking about ecosystems, especially urban ecosystems, is that, you have to talk about those little invisible things, such as insects, that are, that's what birds feed on. That's what fish utilize. That's one of, when you're breaking down what is an ecosystem, that's the food. And if you don't have the right food, and especially food, and I'd love for you to speak to this, is that connection of, in an ecosystem, how natural plants and how insects have evolved and wildlife have evolved along the same path.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions I had when I started my work in salmon recovery, and I think that this is a widespread misconception, and I totally understand, is when we talk about salmon habitat and salmon habitat restoration, we aren't talking about the water that they live in. Obviously, freshwater water quality is an important aspect of that. But when we are talking about the work that we do as conservationists to restore salmon habitat, we're actually talking about land. We're talking about the shorelines, the banks of the river. We call those riparian areas. And it's a little counterintuitive maybe, because you're like, well, salmon aren't living in these riparian areas, but it's still critical to their habitat for several reasons. One, the native plants that live in those riparian areas, there should be a diversity of those plants, live in a balance with each other. So there's not one plant that's taking over and creating a monoculture the way that we see blackberry doing. Two, they attract these terrestrial insects that fall into the water and that are a primary food source for particular juvenile salmonids. And then three, they're also shading the water. And there was a long time when we used to think that the best thing to do for rivers was to pull all the stuff out and clear all the edges and armor everything. And that's the exact opposite. We actually want lots of stuff hanging over our rivers to keep them cool, because as soon as rivers get too warm, that can be fatal to fish. They are, because they're so sensitive, particularly salmon. So these are things that you know, when you think about salmon, you might not think, oh, native plants on the shoreline, but that actually is a critical component of some of the things we can actively do to restore their habitat.
And I want to say too, native plants that are appropriate, because again, you have to know what insects that, again, it's how they evolved together over these millennia. And so not every native plant is going to attract the species that, the juveniles need to eat as a food source. So it's a really complex, interconnected system.
Absolutely. It's particularly complex in the Duwamish Valley. Not only is it really urban and there's a lot of urban pressures and human pressures, not only do you want to find the appropriate plants, it's also tidally influenced. So you're getting this need to have plants that can withstand brackish conditions, saltwater conditions. You're also getting a lot of pollutants in this river, and that's affecting the kinds of plants and animals that can survive here. It's just there's just a lot of stuff happening that make it a lot more complicated than if it were just a natural system.
So that kind of comes into, you've talked a lot about how human activities have shaped and changed our ecosystems. Can you kind of delve into that a little bit more? Just because, the Duwamish section of the river has been highly urbanized over the last century. But we're seeing that the Green River section of the river is becoming more and more urbanized. And so can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think for a large majority of the time, European settlers have treated rivers as like a trash canal. We have sprayed our farm effluent in there that has pesticides in it. We've put our factories right on the river, and anything that was waste we just dumped right into the river. We've just abused this river system, again, treating it not like it's a part of an ecosystem, but as if it's just, a channel for us to get rid of, to take waste away from us. And that has had some very serious consequences. Obviously, the Superfund issues on the river, in addition to things like combined sewage overflows, which we don't have to get into right now. But
that will be another
one,
show,
yeah.
another thrilling show about that one.
Yeah, I mean,
it was kind of gross when I heard about it.
It's shocking. It's absolutely shocking, and the fact that it's not common knowledge is shocking. So that's just a little teaser for the future.
Don't swim in the Duwamish.
Oh my gosh, I know.
Kayak, but don't go swimming.
Oh, I know. It's icky. It's icky. I would stay out. So yeah, we've just done a lot of things to basically ignore the ecosystem and just think about us as humans. And that has had lasting effects. I mean, it's taking millions of dollars to clean up the river and try to restore it back to a condition where we don't have to tell people don't swim in the Duwamish River. That's not right. We shouldn't have to be telling people don't go in this beautiful body of water. People should be free to use the ecosystem in safe and healthy ways and not have to worry about what harm might come to them.
You know, I think there's so many lessons that we are learning from the Duwamish that can be utilized elsewhere, you know, especially up in the green as it's becoming more urbanized and more, you know, more industry, not in light industry, but also just the number of developments going in, which is fine. It's just let's learn our lessons from the Duwamish.
And I think that brings us back to another maybe large scale effect that we're seeing that we've had on ecosystems, which are things like, sure, a single parcel that's being developed doesn't necessarily have a big effect on an ecosystem. When we multiply that out over multiple housing developments, over multiple cities, we start to see those effects. And then we obviously start to see things like climate change and how that's affecting our plant communities. That's affecting our wildlife communities. That's affecting things like extreme weather events, flooding, fires, things that we're seeing more and more of, sea level rise. So those are very high level things. It's very easy to disconnect our actions from those events that are happening and increasing in frequency. But that's another big high level way that we are affecting our ecosystems. For sure.
And it gets back to is that the, you know, evolution happens slowly. So when you do have these extreme impacts, it makes it very challenging for an ecosystem to stay healthy.
Definitely.
So you know, we've talked a lot about the you know, challenges. I'm just wondering, you know, can ecosystems recover, and what does that take?
Yeah, I mean, let's try to be inspirational for a second and not be all doom and gloom. And I think I maybe mentioned this last time. I always want to hesitate to make people feel like the entire responsibility is on you as an individual, because there are a lot of things that you and I can do. A lot of the things are happening at a much higher level than us. So part of that is understanding the regulations that are going on around you that are affecting development and tree code and shoreline code, and, you know, talking to your representatives and paying attention to the news and trying to get the ear of the people who have power, because there are a lot of things that we can do in our daily lives that will accumulate if all of us do them. If we wash our cars at a car wash and not on the street, if we pick up our dog poop, if we clean up, if we take care of oil spills when our car is leaking oil, things like that on a day-to-day basis, volunteering at a restoration event.
And definitely volunteering, and you can go to our website for those opportunities. But I also think too is looking, if you've got a yard, looking at what kind of plants you're planting and thinking about, okay, if you're into pollinators, plant so that you've got blooming plants throughout the year. Obviously not winter, but, you know, consider that your yard or however you caretake, we are all stewards, and make sure that we are supporting ecosystems. And I love your idea too about, you know, a yard or a, you know, one restoration parcel may only support a small number, right, or a small part of the ecosystem. But if it's then expanded by other parcels, by other yards, then it becomes huge.
Yes, absolutely. And particularly for those of us who have, a lot of people don't have yards. A lot of people don't have the time to go volunteer, but a lot of us do. And so for those of us who have those time and resources to make positive changes, it doesn't take that much to do these things and to pay back, give back to the ecosystem that we live in. So whatever is within your capacity, if there's nothing within your capacity, then that's okay too. But whatever is within your capacity, there's always something that you can do.
And I think even just learning more about it, just listening to this show is you're doing something in a positive way. It's a lot of tiny steps.
Yeah.
When we all do it together, we make sea changes. So I totally understand where you're coming from. And so appreciate you being here.
I love being here. Thank you, Sharon.
And I have to say, I know we talked a lot about salmon. We'll talk about some other fun species that we all adore. But the juvenile salmon are coming down now. And there's a lot of places along the river like Northwinds Weir or Kodiga Park or Duwamish Gardens. Hahapus are great places to see them. And we should start seeing salmon returning to spawn. I know like they start in mid-August?
That sounds about right, yeah.
So the height of the salmon season is, that is a loud noise. Anyway, is coming up in September and October. So thank you so much. This is Sharon Leishman with Duwamish Alive Coalition on Rainier Avenue Radio with Alicia Kellogg, King County Duwamish Basin Steward. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.